This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
We were hoping not to have to be here today. Last year when we put down the kinnos, we were hoping it would be for the very last time. As is well known, there's a custom that many place their kinnos in the shemos, as if to say this is the last time we need the kinnos, and Mirz Hashem next year, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. But here we are again, as we learned in the Haftarah of our Katzir, Kol HaKayetz V'Anachnu Lo Noishanu. Another year, another Tisha B'Av. In preparing the kinnos for this year, I was bothered by the following difficulty. You know, there are 45 kinnos that we say as part of the regular kinnos service. 45 b'gematria Adam, perhaps to indicate that it's not only the Beis HaMikdash that is destroyed, but it is we who are supposed to be the Mishkan and the Mikdash for the Shechina. We too are in a state of Churban. But not only are we nechrav, but we are so spiritually bereft and spiritually incapacitated that it's as if all 45 components of our entity are no longer existent, are in a state of devastation. Also, like we learned in the Haftarah, mikaf regel v'yad rosh ein boi mesoim. So it's not only the Mikdash that is nechrav, it is we who are nechrav. And by reciting the 45 kinnos, we try not only to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, we try to rebuild ourselves, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. But I was troubled by the formula of the kinnos, specifically the last 10 kinnos. The last 10 kinnos that we recite on Tisha B'Av are known as the Tzion kinnos. All 10 kinnos begin with the word Tzion, except for one, except for Mem Aleph. All of these 10 kinnos express the fundamental principle that Eretz Yisrael is the chosen land of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But what troubled me is after thinking about the meaning of some of the words of the kinnos, it hit me that they're not kinnos at all. In what way are these kinnos? They're extolling the majesty and the grandeur of Eretz Yisrael, but they're not mournful, they're not morose. For example, in Kino Lamed Vav. Kino Lamed Vav, of course, was written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi writes, the Yotzreich Pasach L'Moshare Shachak Sha'arayach, that the Rebbeinu Shalom opened up opposite the gates of Yerushalayim, the Sharei Mala, so that when somebody davens in Yerushalayim, the tefillos go straight up through the Shamayim. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi continues, Evchar L'Nafshi L'Hishtapech B'Makoim Asher Ruach Elokim Shvucha B'Chiroyach, where the Mekoinen says that I would choose to daven in a place where the Spirit of the Rebbeinu Shalom already poured down on His chosen ones, meaning in a place where the divine connection has long been established. Mi yitneini mishoitet, if only I could drift b'mekoymos asher niglu elokim l'chayzayach v'tziroyach, throughout the land that the Rebbeinu Shalom revealed Himself through prophecy. These are some of the most poetic and beautiful words in description of Eretz Yisrael, but how are they kinnos? If you would have locked me in a room just with these words and asked, what are they? I would have said, piyutim, pizmoinim, tfilos. And in fact, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is considered the greatest of all the paitanim. The Rashba writes in Siman Taf Yud Ches, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is the greatest in merit and distinction of all the paitanim. Not only is he a Talmud of the Rif and the Rimagash, he mastered literary style. It's interesting, in general, the Rishonim were known to be great Oyavei Eretz Yisrael. And there have been many great pilgrims to Eretz Yisrael. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is probably the most renowned. After all, he penned the famous words, Libi b'mizrach v'ani b'soif marav, that even though I live in the far west, my heart dreams of the east. My heart dreams of Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam in the entire Moreh Nevuchim only mentions Eretz Yisrael one time, The Chovos HaLevavos does not even mention Eretz Yisrael in the entire Sefer. Even the Ramban, who risked his life to come to Eretz Yisrael, only writes about Eretz Yisrael in a halachic sense. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, however, expressed his passion in a different style. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, Miyasa li kinafayim ve'archik nedoid. Who would make me wings and I would fly off? Onid lebisrei levavi bein b'seirayach. What does Rabbi Yehuda Halevi mean if I would grow wings? What is he referring to? Clearly he's echoing the words of the greatest Oyev Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu, who we read in the Medrash on Parshas Devarim when the Rebbeinu Shalom told Moshe, Ravlach. So says Moshe Rabbeinu, at least let me go into Eretz Yisrael kechaya ukeoif. At least let me fly through Eretz Yisrael. So Moshe asks, in the Darash Moshe, of what benefit would it be to fly through Eretz Yisrael? The Gemara says in Soita and Daf Yudalad that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to enter Eretz Yisrael to eat the Peiros Haaretz, to be Mekayim Mitzvahs Hatzuyos Ba'aretz. What objective would Moshe accomplish by entering Eretz Yisrael as a bird? Says Rav Moshe, we see from here, merely flying through the airspace of Eretz Yisrael grants a person a tremendous aliyah. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi continues, Apel la'apei alei artzeich, I would fall with my face on your soil. It's interesting. Where does the kedusha of the earth of Eretz Yisrael come from? So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says a very big chiddush, that there in Eretz Yisrael are buried Ma'oirayich, Moshe Rabbeinu, Aaron HaKoyen, and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi points out in the Kinnah that the fact that these tzaddikim and neviim and chasidim are buried in Eretz Yisrael infuses the very soil of Eretz Yisrael with kedusha. In fact, if you look in Sefer Nehemiah on Perek Beis Pasuk Gimel, when Nehemiah was downtrodden and he was sullen, and the king of Persia asked Nehemiah, "What are you so sad about?" So Nehemiah says, "How can I not be crestfallen when the city in which my forefathers are buried is destroyed?" Listen to how he speaks about Eretz Yisrael. What gives Eretz Yisrael kedusha is the fact that Gedolei Yisrael are buried in the earth. And then Rabbi Yehuda Halevi pens perhaps his most stirring words. Chaye neshamois avir artzeich. A breath of life for the soul is the air of your land. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi develops this idea in the Kuzari, that the same way that the body needs oxygen to be vital, to be vibrant, the neshama needs spiritual air to be functional. Says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, living in Chutz La'aretz, it's as if the neshama is gasping for spiritual air. Chaye neshamois avi artzeich. In fact, the great-grandfather of the Chidah comments on the Gemara Bava Basra, Avira da'ara machkim, that the Lashon is Avira, that could be spelled Avir Yud, meaning the Rebbeinu Shalom himself resides in the air of Eretz Yisrael. Even the Chazon Ish said that when he arrived in Eretz Yisrael, his Chidushim took on a much higher form, a more sophisticated form, an elevated form. Marva Rabboisai, how is this a kinnah? Are these words of lament? Are these words of elegy? Words of mourning? Yes, a piyut, a pismine. Why would kinnos end with 10 kinnos on Sion? Are they in their rightful place? And I believe to understand this seemingly unusual ending to the kinnos, we need to go back to the very first Tisha B'Av in history. When the Rebbeinu Shalom took Klal Yisrael out of Mitzrayim, He didn't just rescue a nation from torment, redeem us from slavery. He was submitting these 600,000 nefashos to a new process of creation, whereby He fashioned these Yidden into a new entity called Yisrael, which was inextricably bound to the Torah and bound to Eretz Yisrael. When the Meraglim came back on that first Tisha B'Av, Klal Yisrael had good reason to be concerned al pi derech hateva. They had cheshbonos to make. They had calculations to make. But when they were makabel, that negative report, says the Maral, what they did was they ripped Eretz Yisrael out of the soul of the Yid. So the Ribono Shalom says, you have antipathy to Eretz Yisrael, I will remove it from your destiny for 2,000 years. It's not a punishment. That's the reality. You don't love it, you don't want it, you can't have it. Says the Maral, not only did they accept the report, they cried, they shed tears, which indicated that this antipathy reached the depths of their soul. Says the Ribono Shalom, if your neshama is not connected to Eretz Yisrael, your neshama doesn't belong in Eretz Yisrael. Our mission then, our avodah in reciting Kinnos and in observing Tisha B'Av, and commemorating 2,000 years outside of Eretz Yisrael, is that through yearning for Eretz Yisrael and through pining for Eretz Yisrael, we make Eretz Yisrael part of our neshama again. We recreate the soul bond between a Yid and Eretz Yisrael, meaning the purpose of saying Kinnos is not commemoration, it's not remembering, it's not going through our history. It's reboot. It's to regain a new outlook and perspective toward Eretz Yisrael. To engender a meaningful feeling to Eretz Yisrael so that the neshama of the Yid and Eretz Yisrael are now bound again like they once were 3,300 years ago. The last 10 Kinnos are not part of Kinnos. They're the objective of Kinnos. They're the function of Kinnos. They're the purpose of Kinnos. Perhaps this idea and approach to the Kinnos is best reflected in the lifetime of one of the great heroes of Klal Yisrael in the last 100 years, the Kloisenberger Rebbe. Rabbi Kusil Yehuda Halberstam was the son of Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Halberstam. On his father's side, he's the great-grandson of the Divrei Chaim, and he was the son of the great-granddaughter of the Bnei Yissaschar. At 13 years old, he was recognized as a Goyin Nifla. He was tested on the Hoshas. And when his father passed away a year later, when he was 14, he became a Rav already and got smicha. He married Pesya Teitelbaum, the daughter of the Atzei Chaim of Siget. And at 21 years old, he's already a Rav in one of the most prestigious areas in Hungary, in Kloisenberg. What I'm about to tell you this afternoon has no political motive, there's no agenda, just to say the facts as they are. We all know that Admorim of Hasidus in the mid-19th century were not supportive of Zionism. That's the fact. But what's interesting was that there was a difference of opinion between the Admorim in Poland and the Admorim in Hungary. The Admorim in Poland, or some of them, at least supported a pragmatic cooperation with the secular. Be it Radzin, be it Sachachav, be it the Gerer Rebbes. They supported pragmatic cooperation, but not in Hungary. And we don't have to get into details and names, but that's the reality. And in fact, that's the only way the Rebbe got the job. In 1910, there were two groups of Jews in Hungary. There was enlightened and there was the Orthodox. And the Orthodox fought for autonomy and independence, and they won it. And they appointed as their leader one of a great Goin, fourth generation from the Chassam Sofer. I love his Svarim, the Dar Ravi, on Masechta Chulin, Rav Moshe Glasner. He wrote an amazing Sefer on Chumash, but he had an open view toward Eretz Yisrael, and the Charedim did not agree with it. And they fought to break away, and in 1919 they did. And once they gained independence, then and only then, the Kloisenberger Rebbe became the Rav of the Hasidim in Poland and Kloisenberg. That was the climate, and those are the facts. But things changed. During the Holocaust, the Rebbe was part of a labor force to to clear out the remains of the Warsaw Ghetto. He was sent to Auschwitz, and he was on the infamous death march from the Warsaw Ghetto to Dachau. If I could just describe a little bit that death march from the Warsaw Ghetto to Dachau, 6,000 broken Yidden ordered to march 70 miles, 21 miles a day in the dead summer heat on Ches Av, Tes Av, Yud Av, in a year like this where Tisha B'Av came out on Shabbos. The prisoners were not allowed to stop even for a moment, not to rest, not to relieve themselves, like the pasuk says in Eicha, Vayelchu b'loi koyach lefnei roideif. Without food, without drink, kicking up dust, the dust encrusted their lips, their tongues, and their esophagus. There were prisoners who stored away pieces of bread in their pockets, but when they tried to eat it, the bread became lodged in their throats because they had no moisture. Here's how the march began. The SS officers announced, if anyone's too tired, if anyone's weary, we're going to be providing bus service. 240 prisoners were gullible to believe this scam, and they were shot on the spot. We're down to 5,700. Fortunately, the Kloisenberger Rebbe did not fall for it. 21 miles a day by foot. The hot summer beat down on them. It was Friday, the 8th day of Av. The commander and his assistants rode in cars. If anyone slowed down, they were run over and shot. The farmers on the side of the road tried to provide water for these prisoners, and they were beat by the SS guards. It's now Friday night, Tisha B'Av. And the Rebbe had a minhag that on Shabbos Chazoin, he would say over from the Abt Rav Yeshua Heschel of Abt, I was just zoichet to be in his shul and his kever in Mezhbej. The Abt Rav writes, Shabbos Chazoin is the holiest Shabbos of the year, especially when it's Tisha B'Av. But that fateful Shabbos morning, the inmates were woken by piercing shrieks. They rose quickly with the instincts of a hunted animal. The Nazis said, the sun is going to be unbearable today. We need to march the 21 miles before the sun hits its pinnacle. They had to take a very fast pace, but it was Shabbos and everyone had their bag, and the Rebbe would not carry his bag on the Heilige Shabbos. But to give it to somebody else, he would be risking his life. One of his Hasidim, Rabbi Yaakov Friedman, without asking any questions, quickly took the Rebbe's bag. He said it's a bigger inyan only for one person to carry than two people to carry. But a guard spotted the exchange. He grabbed the Rebbe. He beat him mercilessly with the butt of his revolver. He accused the Rebbe of sabotage. He brought him to the commander to be shot. And the commander looks at the Rebbe, expecting him to be white. The Rebbe was beaming with pride that he was about to be zoicha, to be killed, because he wasn't mechalel the Shabbos. Suddenly a miracle occurred, and another officer took the Rebbe and pushed him back into the line. But the Rebbe did not emerge unscathed. He sustained a large bloody wound near his rib cage from which he suffered from for his entire life. The sun beat down on the prisoners. Every so often a prisoner fell to the ground, dead. They were skeletons. The prisoners passed by renowned cities in Poland, the city of Kutna. My great-grandfather was a Talmud of Rabbi Shiur Kutna in Poland. The city of Sachachev. My other Elta Zayda was the Rav of Sachachev. Last summer I had the zechus to go back to Sachachev. You know how many Yidden are in Sachachev today? 0. There's one Yiddish woman married to a guy in Sachachev today. Sachachev was the Ir V'Aim B'Yisrael. My grandmother Aleh Hashem was buried on Har HaZeisim a year and a half ago, so the mishpacha put the names of all of her siblings on her kever. Shmuel Hersh, Fradel, Faika, Avram Yitzchak, her mother, Hena Rasha. There's no remnant of Sachachev today. If you want to go to the kever of the Avnei Nezer, there's not even a yid who has the key. You have to go to the flower shop. It's only in the hands of a guy. Now it's the third day of the march. It's Tisha B'Av, the most dreadful day on our calendar. The torture reached its zenith. The Nazis knew it was Tisha B'Av. They killed more people that day than any other day. People fell, their corpses lay on the ground without burial. Whoever was still alive was a skeleton, was a walking cadaver. Their faces were sunburned, covered with dirt and dust, gravel in their throats. Prisoners would say, "I can't continue." They would open up their shirts and order the Nazi either give me water or shoot me. But the whole day, the Rebbe continued to march, barefoot. Why barefoot? Because it was Tisha B'Av, and the Shulchan Aruch says, Nilas HaSandal is Asur. And the Rebbe whispered to himself, psukim from the Eicha and the Kinnis. And one of the guards spotted him. He said, "Rabbi, what are you muttering?" And he said, "You're going to walk on the glass and the gravel on the side of the road." And after a short amount of time, when the Rebbe couldn't bear it anymore, he realized he had to jump out or save himself. So he tried to slip off to the side of the road, but the last guard caught eye of the Klausenberger Rebbe, shot at the Rebbe, he hit the Rebbe. His arm is gushing with blood, but the Klausenberger Rebbe, in the flash of an eye, made a cheshbon that if he's going to make it known that he's bleeding, they would finish him off. So he grabbed some wet leaves, bandaged himself, head back into the line. On July 29th, 1980, when the Rebbe laid the cornerstone of the Sanz Laniado Hospital, he relayed that at the moment that this miracle occurred, he pledged that if he were to survive, he would build a hospital for Yidden. The prisoners are on the verge of utter collapse. The guards barked, "You know what? We're going to take a rest. Stop right here." And they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Out in the distance, they spotted a river. But instead of waiting for orders, a few of them ran quickly to the river. What else would one do if they're dying of thirst? The Nazis took out their machine guns, mowed down whatever Yidden ran to the river. And the commander said with a satanic smile, "We did this to save everyone else's life, just in case not everybody knows how to swim. But because you ran without permission, nobody will drink today." 72 hours the Rebbe went without food or water. But off to the side of the river, there was a moist area. The Rebbe, together with one of his Hasidim, Mendel Wieder, grabbed a few moist branches and leaves, but they wouldn't drink it. Because who could drink on Yom Kippur, on Tisha B'Av? So they just wet their lips and their tongue. It was now Motzoi Tisha B'Av. They selected an open field to rest. The prisoners fell to the ground like broken tree limbs. Exhausted, dehydrated, they couldn't even sleep because they were so dehydrated. But the Nazis were fat chazerim, and they fell asleep. The Rebbe looked around. When he noticed that all the Nazis were sleeping, he whispered the following: "Try, everyone try, dig beneath yourselves." And so they took out spoons, and with their fingers and their fingernails, they dug a few small holes, and the holes became larger, and the water began to gush forth. "We were afraid to speak loudly," writes one of the eyewitnesses, "but we hugged and kissed each other. Jews who were half dead were resurrected and resuscitated. With parched lips, with lips encrusted with dirt, Yidden said, 'Melech ha'olam shehakoil nihiyeh b'dvaroi.'" In the morning, the commander came back, and where did the water come from? When he saw the miracle of the water, he was ashamed, he was embarrassed, and he marched everyone off. After the war, one of the Rebbe's Hasidim, Rabbi Yaakov Getzel Schiff, He heard the story, he said, Rebbe, is it true? The Rebbe said, if anyone doubted that when Avram Avinu went to the Akedah, an Ayil appeared, if anyone doubted that in the Midbar, a Be'er appeared, all they needed to do was to see us march to Dachau and to see Be'er Mayim Chayim. And that the Rebbeinu Shalom could provide at any time. This Nes strengthened the Rebbe, encouraged the Rebbe. He said the Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't make Nisim for nothing. We will survive. Of the close to 6,000 prisoners who left Warsaw, less than 2,000 made it to Dachau. The Rebbe lost his wife, lost all of his children. But the Rebbe made another promise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He promised the Rebbeinu Shalom that if he would survive the inferno, he would move to Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, from Kloisenberg. The Rebbe, when he left Germany, so his Hasidim said, where are you going, to America? Why are you going to America? He said, I'm not going to America. I'm going to Eretz Yisrael via America. A Radomsker Chassid once asked the Rebbe, where does your love for Eretz Yisrael come from? So the Rebbe opened his drawer and he pulled out a very controversial sefer. The sefer Koilel HaIvrim, Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger. Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger wrote about 160 years ago, encouraging all of Klal Yisrael, especially the Fruma Yidden, to go to Eretz Yisrael. He said the Kloisenberger Rebbe, and again, this is not my opinion, and I'm not here to speak politics, I'm telling you the Shita of the Kloisenberger Rebbe. Said the Rebbe, and I heard this from my Zayda, Zol Gesundsein, many, many times, that if Klal Yisrael would have listened to the advice of Rav Schlesinger, hundreds, if not thousands, and probably millions of Yidden would not have perished in the Holocaust. You know why we didn't go, said the Kloisenberger Rebbe? Masa Satan, he said. In 1953, they asked the Rebbe, why don't you go to Eretz Yisrael already? He said, because I long for Eretz Yisrael more than anyone. The moment I get there, I'll never be able to leave. Finally, the Rebbe made plans to move to Eretz Yisrael. He traveled there via London. He comes to London, to the Hasidic community in London, and the Rebbe gave a stirring speech. He spoke about the Kedushas Haaretz. He spoke encouraging the Fruma Yidden to rebuild Eretz Yisrael, again by the Malava Malka. Motzoi Shabbos, one of the leaders of the community in London, it turns out I'm related to them, was upset that the Rebbe came out such a staunch supporter of Eretz Yisrael. He said very softly, maybe Rebbe, you need to rethink how you're phrasing your words. What are people going to say? You know, not everyone in Eretz Yisrael are Maminim. And it was in this point of time, the Rebbe clearly enunciated a change in attitude. Said the Kloisenberger Rebbe, we from a Yidden like to criticize Eretz Yisrael while the secular build Eretz Yisrael. I used to curse them. Says the Rebbe, when I used to say V'lam al Shinim, my kavana was those who went to Eretz Yisrael. That was my kavana. I said it b'demois. But I noticed something. None of my klalos helped. None of my curses helped. They were only getting stronger. I therefore said to myself, why don't we switch roles? Maybe I should build Eretz Yisrael and they'll curse me. I'm not saying what I heard. This is printed in the official biography of the Kloisenberger Rebbe, Lapid Eish, page 383. Says the Kloisenberger, I resolved to stop this mode of action. We'll no longer stand on the side and criticize. We'll build, let them criticize. Marv Rabbi say, is kina lamid vav a kina tzion halois shali? Is kina lamid ches tzion ateres tzvi tzion the most desirable crown? Is that a kina? Tzion yedidus yedid. Tzion is the love of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Tzion tfiras pe'er, a crown of splendor. Are these kinos? Yes. They're the purpose of Kinnos. They're the objective of Kinnos. That after thinking about 2,000 years in Chutz La'aretz, we need to reach the Madrega that the Kloisenberger Rebbe came to, where he realized that finally we need to express an unbridled love toward Eretz Yisrael. Because if what got us in the mess in the first place, as the Maharal explains, is by crying about Eretz Yisrael, making cheshbonos about Eretz Yisrael, criticizing Eretz Yisrael, then the tikkun is kinol amid vav to kinol memhei. Beli cheshbon, ahava beli gevul. Libi oimerli, my heart tells me that this is the secret of the format of Kinnos. The last 10 Kinnos are not mournful, they're the objective of what we're trying to accomplish. And I feel that I received an endorsement min hashamayim, because as I was about to finish preparing this, at the very end of the biography of the Kloisenberger Rebbe, it's written that when the Kloisenberger Rebbe's plane took off from London to land in Eretz Yisrael for the very first time, with tears streaming down his face, his body trembling, the Kloisenberger Rebbe only uttered 4 sentences. Tzion haloi sishali kin olam vav. Tzion ateres tzvi kin olam ches. Tzion yedidus yedid kin amem. Tzion sefiras per kin amem beis. Demonstrating what the objective of Kinnos is. There happens to be one Kinna that doesn't begin with the word Tzion, Shali Srufa Be'esh. Maybe that's to indicate, yes, of course we need Das Torah, and we have to ask our Manhigim and our Rabbeim. I'm just pointing out the attitude of the Kloisenberger Rebbe. Unbridled love for Eretz Yisrael. The Kloisenberger Rebbe was a trailblazer. He met the early founders of the state. He met Ben Gurion. And Ben Gurion asked him, Holy Rabbi, what does the state of Israel mean to you? What does it do for you? How do you envision it? The Rebbe said, worst case scenario, Shabbos morning, I walk outside in a bigger strammel, and nobody says boo, and I won't be persecuted. And Ben Gurion said, and what's best case scenario? Best case scenario. Best case scenario, Ben Gurion, is you'll be wearing a strammel. The Talmidei Kloisenberger asked him, should we move to Eretz Yisrael? Should we move there? There are different shittas. He said, we just landed in Parshas Devarim. Boyu u'reshu es ha'aretz. Just come. Beli cheshbon. And the Rebbe would say, the last king that needed to be conquered before entering Eretz Yisrael, Melech Cheshbon, says the Rebbe, that teaches if you want to be Zoicha, you can't make cheshbonos. It's ahava mekalkelas hasashura. What do you mean? Aren't you supposed to make cheshbonos? Veheve mechashev. Not when there's ahava. Ahava mekalkelas hasashura. But look how the Rebbe saw things, the exact opposite of the entire world. 1967. The Western wall, the Koisem Aravi, is liberated. For the first time, Yidden are able to be Maspalel in the holiest spot that we have access to. That year, the first night of Slichos, my dear friend Ramosha Morgenstern sent me a clip of the drasha of Kloisenberger Rebbe. You cannot hear this drasha without breaking down. The Rebbe said that the liberation of the Koisel HaMaravi is perhaps the most painful moment in the history of Klal Yisrael. After all this, that's not what you expected to hear. The Rebbe said there was a king, who had a wayward son, a depraved son, a debased son, so despicable that the father chased him out of the palace. And after many years of the son languishing and wallowing outside of the palace, the father sent word to his son, you know what? Come back to a ruin 100 feet away from thy home. I don't want to look at you and I don't let you look at me. You stay by the Churban. Can you imagine what the son feels after that terrible rejection after so many years where the father says, "Don't come yet into my house." That was the feeling that the Kloisenberger Rebbe had for Eretz Yisrael, for Yerushalayim, and for the Beis HaMikdash. And I believe that this is the paradigm and the pattern of the Kinnos. After reliving 35 Kinnos of tragedy, we need to get back, reboot, and regain that Kesher Neshama, Kesher Nafshi with Eretz Yisrael. Because Rebbeinu Shalom said, "I'm not punishing you. The reason you're not in Eretz Yisrael for 2,000 years is because you're not connected to Eretz Yisrael. You don't want it. You cried about it." But as we recite these last 10 Kinnos, Tzion Halois Shali, Tzion Sevi Seferas, Tzion Yedidus Yedid, we try to recreate the Kesher Neshama with Eretz Yisrael. We try to bring Eretz Yisrael back into our reality, back into our spiritual DNA. Because when we yearn and dream and pine for Tzion, for Eretz Yisrael, the Rebbeinu Shalom says it will become again part of your national reality. In the zechus of trying to be misabel over Eretz Yisrael, over the Beis HaMikdash, Rebbeinu Shalom should give us all siyata d'shmaya to see be'einenu the Gbias Goel Tzedek, the Binyan Yerushalayim, and the return of the Shechina to Tzion b'mher v'yameinu. Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.